So I'm going to talk about plastic, and in order to do that, I need to tell you what plastic is. And maybe you think you know, but it's actually quite complex. And I'm also going to talk about microplastics and what we know there and why they might be a problem. So before I get into plastics, I just want to start off by saying that plastics are fantastic. This is a picture from the 1940s, 1950s Time magazine. Plastics are a material that we use really in so many aspects of our life, and our society today would not function without plastic, because pretty soon I'm going to start telling you why plastics are horrible things, but they're really fantastic things. And we have them in so many products. We have them in all of our electronics and technology. They're important in food and hygiene, in medicine, in the transport sector, in clothing, in building materials. So now that I've said that, we know plastics are great when they're used properly and in the right way, but they also pose a lot of environmental problems. So now we'll move on. What is plastic? Plastic, and this is one of the first plastics that was mass produced. It's called bakelit, it's called. So that's something that the older people in the room might recognize. I know my kids saw one of those and they weren't really sure how you should use that to make a phone call. But plastic has been around, it's been produced in high volume since the 1950s. But it's a synthetic organic polymer, which means that it's a chain of molecules called monomers that are similar to one another. And those monomers are produced usually from petrochemicals. So oil is the major source that we normally use for production of plastics. There are other sources that you can use, like cornstarch or vegetable oil. But the polymers or monomers and polymers that are produced from those sources are the same as the ones that we produce from the oil. So that's important to remember when we're discussing bioplastics, a term that's often used and not very well defined. The word plastic means that something is light, malleable, and durable. So that's the definition of the word, and we've taken that word to apply it to these materials that we produce. So I said before that we have plastic polymers. So these are the monomers, these molecules that are produced from our raw material, and they are polymerized into chains called polymers through chemical reactions here. In order to produce the polymers, we use our raw material, the monomers, and then we add catalysts and enzymes and other chemicals that drive that reaction forward. So in our plastic material, we will have these polymers. We will also have some monomers that have not gone through the synthesis reaction, and there could be residual chemicals left from the synthesis, from the polymerization reaction in the plastic. We might also have non-intentionally added substances. So these are contaminants that are following from our raw materials. And they might also be products that are byproducts that are produced in the chemical reactions or breakdown products of any of the other compounds that are in that mixture there. And then we have our additives. So these are all the other things that we add to our chemical products. So when we talk about plastics, we're usually talking about a big mixture of things. So we might have our polymer and then add a flame retardant to it, or a pigment, or a UV stabilizer, or any other chemicals that might give the product the qualities that we want in whatever we're using it for. So these could be like softeners as well. And then when we talk about plastics in the environment, we also have all these other hydrophobic substances that can bind to the plastics. So chemicals that have hydrophobic qualities will bind to plastics. And we know this from environmental studies where a lot of groups have collected plastics on beaches and in the oceans, and they measure chemical content, and they find really high levels of POPs, these persistent organic pollutants, like dioxins, PCBs, PAHs. We're finding in these. We're also finding pesticides and metals in the plastics. So when we talk about plastics in the environment, we're talking about all of these things plus all the other chemicals that we're using, or the hydrophobic ones. This is a picture from Kenya. And Kenya actually is one of the countries that has gone out with one of the hardest laws against plastics or single-use plastic bags, or bags for, is it grocery stores only? My law people, yeah. Yeah, so, and I noticed when I was down there that people are walking home from stores using cloth bags. They're not using plastic bags anymore. But I did see some plastic bags in trash bins, actually. So they're still around. But that's one of the hardest laws that have been put into place, but that's sort of demonstrating how big the problem actually is. And this picture is mostly PET. It's water bottles. So it's a kind of plastic that is very easily recycled, actually. And here in Europe, we have this pant system where you have a deposit where you can leave the bottles back for recycling. And that's a pretty closed cycle as close as we get in this circular economy way of thinking in terms of recycling plastic materials, but there's a really big leakage from that system, and it's a really big problem. Most of the times when we're talking about plastic pollution in the environment, we're talking about the ocean, and the vast majority of research has been done in waters and in the ocean, but it's a big problem on land too. The science is just lagging behind there in terms of how it's spreading, where it's going, and what effects that it's having. So animals, land animals like cows and camels have been found with large volumes of plastic bags in their stomachs as well. And this next picture is from Sweden. This is from Bohuslän, so northern west coast of Sweden. And this is a lot of fishing gear that's washing up on the shores. About 80% of the trash that's found on shorelines around the world is plastic. And in Sweden, about 80% of the trash that's found on shorelines is thought to come from outside of Sweden. So this is a problem that's very international, and it's cross-boundary. This one. Which one? Okay, sorry. Okay, so these kinds of pictures, a lot of us have seen on the internet. Maybe you recognize these. These pictures that really aim for people's hearts to try to get them to respond to the problems of plastics. And I'm going to come back to why that has been actually pretty successful and really important. But these are pictures showing animals that are suffering from lost or discarded fishing gear. And this is a common problem. This fishing gear is long-lived in the ocean. There are large volumes of it. The Baltic Sea has a lot of it, but they continue fishing and killing animals when they're out in the oceans. Another problem that has been clearly identified with plastics is that animals eat it. So it fills their stomachs and it causes internal damage, and they either die from injuries or from starvation. These pictures of birds were from an island in the Pacific where there were no people. So it was an uninhabited island. It was a nature reserve. And there was so much plastic washing ashore there that the birds were feeding to their young that they were dying from this. So there was a movie made about these birds on this island, and that was also one of the first big movements in activism against plastic in the environment. It's called Midway Island, if anyone wants to watch it. Plastic can also destroy ecosystems. So it can cover entire bottoms. It can cover and block, if it's floating, it can block light from entering into the water and affect what's growing there, and it can also lay on the bottoms and cover entire bottoms. So it's destroying ecosystems at the same time as it's creating new surface areas for organisms to grow on. So another problem that's been identified with plastics is spreading of invasive species that are sort of hitchhiking on plastics that's floating in the waters. And this includes larger animals like crabs that are laying eggs on them or sitting on themselves, but even in freshwater systems, mosquito larvae, it's thought to be complicit in the spread of Zika virus and malaria, since the plastics are providing substrates for these animals to grow on. So 2 years ago, the UNEP did a calculation of what plastic is costing the environment, and they came up with a number like 75 billion per year in natural capital, and 13 billion of that should be in marine ecosystems. So the costs in marine ecosystems include lost income due to decreased fishing, to decreased tourism, to destruction of different ecosystems, to decreased growth rates in aquaculture, to problems with shipping, where boat propellers are getting tangled up with plastics or water intake systems are being blocked. So they're having problems with engine cooling. But $13 billion a year in the ocean, and the rest is in land, and some of that's associated with carbon dioxide and land usage and so on. So it's pretty costly. And as I told you just a few minutes ago, it's a cross-boundary problem. And this is my film that doesn't want to start, maybe? There we go. So this is a model that we produced together with some oceanographers in the Marine Department, where we were trying to address the problem here in SIDS, in small island developing states, which are receiving a disproportionate amount of plastics from the oceans and from the tourist industry, as well as input of goods. But what you can see is that the plastics really are following the ocean currents, and the regions that they're being released from are not always able to take care of that plastics themselves, but they end up in other countries. And I don't know if you had time to see it, but Sweden and Norway and the Arctic region receive a lot of plastic from Europe and from the Baltic Sea. Did you all see that? Maybe a little bit. And I know the SIDS are receiving a lot of trash from Western Africa and from South America. So it really is an international problem that's going to require international cooperation to handle. Now we move on to microplastics. What are microplastics? Well, as the word sounds, they're small. So they're small pieces of plastics, but we don't really have a good definition of what a microplastic is, and it's kind of a little bit sloppy of science. But we use the word microplastic to mean everything from 1 millimeter, in some cases even 5 millimeters, all the way down to 1 nanometer. So that's a really huge spread in the size of particles that we're talking about, and it really affects how we're identifying them when we're doing analyses to find them in water samples. So here's what a water sample might look like when water has been poured through a filter. And you'll see sand particles and other naturally occurring particles, but you'll also see fibers, maybe it's hard to see here, but some small pieces of styrofoam, expanded styrofoam. And the kinds of particles that you will find will be completely dependent on the methods that you use to sample your water, the filter size that you're using, where you're taking your samples, and how you're taking your samples. And the size of the particles will also dictate how they behave in interaction with biological organisms. So a 5 millimeter particle will have a very different biological effect than something that's 20 nanometers in terms of being taken up, moving across membranes, or even being consumed, and the rate that it's passing through the gut, or if it's affecting the animal's gills. We also have a lot of different polymers. So the top produced polymers are polyethylene, polypropylene, polystyrene, PET, polyethylene phthalate, I think, terephthalate. I can never pronounce that one. Polyvinyl chloride. And these sort of match the top produced polymers are also the ones that we find most of in the ocean, so that kind of makes sense. According to Plastics Europe, about 40% of the plastics that are produced for packaging materials. And these are very often escaping the recycling system, and they're ending up in the environment. So we're finding a lot of those materials. The word microplastic also includes different shapes of particles. So some of them will be round, and these will be like the pre-production pellets that are produced as raw materials. We can have films from a lot from packaging material, fragments from larger particles like you see up here, where litter is breaking down, and that is occurring because of UV degradation and mechanical weave action and so on. And we find a lot of fibers. So there's also been a lot of talk lately about microfibers and fibers from textiles that are made from plastic polymers that we're finding pretty much everywhere we look. And these shapes will also affect their potential biological effect and how they're behaving in interactions with organisms. And on top of all these things, we also have chemicals. So we have our plastic polymer, whatever chemical additives they might have been included in the products that were lost from our consumer systems or production systems, and environmental contaminants that are binding to them. And different polymers might bind different chemicals. So this is a really complex question that we're addressing that has a lot of different details. And when we're working with this in the laboratory and trying to understand what effects microplastics have on organisms, we can't do all of this at once. So we tend to pick one thing at a time. And we work with one polymer in one shape, in one size. And we might contaminate that with a model, a chemical, or as Giedra has been doing with complex mixtures of chemicals. Most of the times we're only using one of these things. So the picture that we're getting when we're doing our studies is very small, and it's very hard to sort of make generalizations and extrapolate from our lab studies into the environment where we have lots of other particles. So you have in the lab one plastic particle in a pretty high concentration, and in the environment you might have a fish that eats 6 particles and 100,000 other particles that are naturally occurring. So that makes it really hard for us to understand what might be happening in the ocean, while we're maybe starting to understand the mechanisms of effect in really simplified scenarios in the lab. Where are microplastics coming from, you ask? They have a number of different sources, and there's been a lot of work done on identifying this. Sweden and IVL, who are located partly in this house, have been working on that a lot together with the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency and other groups all around the world. But we have leakage of industrial pellets. So these are new produced pellets, these nurdles that you can find on the beaches. You can find them along the Swedish west coast. If you go a little bit north of here and look, you'll find handfuls of them. Personal hygiene products. So these are microbeads that you can find in face mask and toothpaste. They've been outlawed in a number of countries, in the United States, in England, in France, and it's being discussed in Sweden right now, but they haven't really gotten that far yet. Textiles and fleece, so these are the fibers that you see, like these here. And these are being released when we wash clothing. And industrial scrubbers, so when people are sandblasting equipment, this is a technique that's used in cleaning machinery a lot, or in removing paint. They use not sand, but plastic pellets. And then we have secondary microplastics. And this is actually thought to be one of the biggest sources because we're losing such large volumes of litter from large plastic objects in the environment. So these are degrading into smaller and smaller pieces until they reach what we define as microplastic size. This includes paint chips, both from paint used on land and in boats, consumer goods and packaging materials, plastic bags, which are sold in the millions every minute around the world, lost and discarded fishing gear, and anything else that might be made of a polymer that's lost into the environment. And the three sources that were identified as the largest sources in Sweden were road and tire wear particles. So here the word microplastic has been expanded to include other polymers like rubber, which is a naturally occurring particle in some cases, but can also be produced. Road can include bitumen, and the paint that you see on roads is also a plastic polymer. So this is being worn down and washed into our stormwater drains. And tires in themselves are constructed to lose 30% of their mass during their lifetime. So they're being worn down on the roads and producing micro and nanoparticles that are washing into stormwater drains. Artificial turf is a second. And this is playing fields with plastic grass straws and then a granulate of rubber. And some fields can require filling of 7 to 8 tons of this material every year, which is spreading in the environment in different ways. And then we have household sources, and this includes those things you'll find in personal hygiene products and in textiles, in the clothing that we're washing. And where does the plastic go? A lot of it ends up in the oceans. The vast majority of it, we think, in terms of microplastics. These are pictures showing concentrations of microplastics according to size. So here is up to 1 millimeter, and then these are bigger and bigger sizes here. And you can see that there's concentrations in what we call the ocean gyres. So these are hot spots for microplastics, but newer studies are also showing, because if you notice down here, they don't have any microplastics. It's because I think they haven't been sailing down there taking samples. But newer studies that are coming out now are also showing that Antarctica has a lot of microplastics, and they coincide in concentration with the research stations. So these red spots are research stations, and the yellow and green are sites where they're finding microplastics and macroplastics. So now we're moving on to why they're a problem. Well, we find it everywhere. We even find it in the air that we breathe. In Europe, approximately 300 fibers will land on 1 square meter of surface every day. We know that animals eat it because we find it in animals in the environment. We find it in animals throughout the entire food chain. And we also know through experimental studies that they can be passed up through the food chain. And you could define this in itself as a problem, that the plastics are there and that they're being consumed by animals. But we have also done a number of effect studies. And we know that these chemicals that are in the environment can bind to plastics, and that these chemicals can be taken up by animals that are eating them. So this is something that has been modeled. So people have used mathematical formulas and predictions to see whether the chemicals that are in plastics will be released into animals that are eating them. And some of the models say, no, this is not a problem. And the reason why they say this is because the chemicals should be binding so tightly to the particles that they should not be released into the organisms. But they're models, and models are inherently wrong. We can learn a lot from them. They can be very, very useful. But they can also be oversimplified and be missing some data. So experimental research shows that the chemicals can be moved from the particles into organisms that are eating them. But again, this is in laboratory studies. We can't do this in the ocean, but we can do this in labs. And in labs, we see that the chemicals can be moved from the particles into the animals, but we're using unrealistic concentrations. So we're working with levels of plastics that are much higher than you're finding in organisms in the oceans. So the relative importance of this vector pathway in a real-life scenario is still unknown. The kinds of effects that we are seeing, though, in laboratory studies when we're feeding organisms with plastics include these. And this is just a collection of different kinds of effects from a large number of studies, where we're looking at everything from algae to invertebrates to filter feeders and fish, so vertebrate organisms. And we're seeing changes in nutrient uptake. So animals that are eating a lot of plastics obviously are not eating as much food, so they're having a decreased nutrient uptake. We can find damage to the gut in some cases, effects on lipid metabolism, effects in growth, decreased reproduction, behavioral changes, immunotoxic effects, and changes in detoxification mechanisms that are taking care of the chemicals that are associated with these plastics. And a lot of the chemicals that we're finding in plastics are known to have adverse health effects in humans as well. So this is just a picture showing you some of the effects that have been associated with chemicals in humans. And now in humans, we don't do experiments, obviously. So these are data from large-scale studies where they're correlating exposures to outcomes. And correlations are also a bit dangerous because you're not showing causation. You're just showing a correlation between a chemical concentration and health effect. But a lot of these studies have been repeated a number of times, and some of them include 500,000 cohorts. And we also can use laboratory studies and experimentation to try to understand the mechanisms linking the chemical exposure to the health outcome effect. And in some cases, we understand those pathways. So we can start to conclude that this is true, or there's some truth to this, and that this is problematic. And we also know that this can be a multi-generational problem, because a woman that is pregnant and is exposed to a chemical will also expose her unborn child at the same time. And if she's pregnant with a daughter, her eggs will be developing in utero, so her grandchildren will also be exposed to those chemicals. And there are studies showing that you can find chemical effects over up to 4 generations in humans. But we also have some studies that are failing to find effects. And this is kind of interesting. And here I just have one example, because I just got home from Nairobi and I didn't finish my slides. But there are 2 or 3 other examples showing publications where scientists have done robust experimental studies and found no effects. And this is interesting to discuss in and of itself, because science tends to want to publish studies that do show effects. And publishing something where you don't find effects tends to be difficult, because you don't really know what happened and why you're not seeing an effect. But some of the studies that are coming out are a bit more robust, and they are showing us that, no, I couldn't find the PCBs in any of the animals. Or there was another study on an invertebrate too, showing no effect in growth or behavior. So this is a little bit of a move away from the publication bias that we tend to have in scientific experimentation and publication, which is kind of interesting, because this field is really, really hot right now. It's a problem that is worldwide, that's global, and that has really caught the public's attention and the attention of policymakers who have taken the knowledge concerning microplastics, their presence, their release, and their spread in the environment, and moved ahead with policy decisions before the science was really there to explain the effect side of it. And that in of itself, I think, makes a quite interesting discussion. But just so you're aware of that. So we see some studies where we're having effects, so we can describe mechanisms of exposure and what's happening in the animals. But we're also finding some studies coming out now where they're finding no effects. I often get the question of whether or not we're exposed to plastics and whether or not it's a problem for human health. And I can say, absolutely, we are definitely exposed to plastics. I started off saying that we have our entire environment filled with plastics, and then we use them for many really, really good applications. But we also have them in some completely unnecessary applications, like toothpaste and face wash. This has been banned in some countries, as I said before, not Sweden as of yet. And textiles, which is another exploding industry, which I can talk more about later if you're interested in what's going on there. Yes, we do find it in human seafood. So plastics have been found in the gut of crayfish and shrimp. They've been found in filter feeders. And these are the organisms in the environment that have the highest levels of microplastics. And this is a consequence of their feeding behavior and how they filter particles out of the water, so they can have up to 10,000 times higher levels in their bodies than you find in the water. And we also eat the entire animal here when we eat these. Other animals, we clean away the gut, so we're not eating what might be in their gut content. But in these animals, we eat the whole thing. And we also find it in beer, and we find it in honey, and we find it in table salt. And we know now that we breathe plastic. So yeah, humans are exposed. A study came out this summer showing that microplastic is also present in drinking water. And this was done in a number of countries worldwide. And they found up to 83% of water samples that were taken on a global scale had microplastics in tap water, including Donald Trump's White House. So he drinks it too. And then some students and myself put together this picture to try to figure out how important this is as a pathway. If you have a person here, or a person in the middle, who is being exposed potentially to microplastics by eating seafood, is this a problem? Is a question that we often hear. So here we have our fish in the environment, and the fish might have some microplastics in its gut that it's either eaten itself or drank in the water or taken up through whatever prey it's eating. But that fish, once it's brought into preparation for human consumption, will go through a factory system where it can also be exposed to microplastics through air deposition, or microplastics can be cleaned away from the gut. And that human is also being exposed to microplastics by wearing clothes and by brushing their teeth and by breathing air. So the relative importance of microplastic in that fish is probably pretty small. We also had a look at this question. Are we exposed to chemicals in microplastics? So we know that microplastics can contain high levels of chemicals, and we know those chemicals can move from plastics into animals, at least in some animal studies. So we did some rough calculations, and these are just really rough calculations. But we took some numbers from the literature, and we looked at if we have a blue mussel that has a lot of microplastics in it, how many microplastics does it have? And then we looked at a human population where people eat a lot of blue mussels. And then we looked at chemical data for microplastics in the environment, and we picked the highest numbers we could find for BPA, which is a chemical that has been associated with negative outcomes in humans. And we found that that person that eats a lot of blue mussels, that have a lot of microplastics, that have a lot of BPA, will consume this much every year. And then we had a look at how much a person will be exposed to just from eating food that is packaged. And we found this number. So again, these are just kind of rough playing with number calculations, but even if we're off by a factor of 10 or 100 or 1,000, this is still a much more important pathway for exposure. So what do we do about all this? So the field of microplastic research is ongoing, and we're not really there yet. It's taken us years to find methods to find the plastics in the environment, to identify them. When you have a water sample and you filter it and you find a little blue thing, you have to know what that is if you're going to try to understand where it comes from, what it does, what kinds of effect or impact it could possibly have. And about the chemical data is also kind of a growing field, but that's much more established. When it comes to microplastic exposure in itself, we're also kind of in our youths. We're finding some effects, we're finding some no effects. So there's no real consensus on the impact of microplastics in health. But if we sort of pick apart this question in how we're going to handle it, we might have to look at it from two different perspectives, where we talk about microplastics and chemicals separately. Or maybe we need to discuss them together. Or maybe we need to discuss plastics on its own as a big problem that encompasses all of these other things. And this is kind of where the global community is right now, because this is what's being spoken about and what a lot of policy is focusing on. Well, this is probably the biggest problem. And this incorporates all of the other questions there. But who's involved in this decision-making in these discussions? Well, it's the scientists that are producing the data to try to explain what's going on. It's policymakers, it's NGOs and media, the general public that has a vested interest in all of these questions, of course. It's industry that's producing the plastics and the chemicals and the products that we're using that contain plastics and chemicals. And it might even be others that I missed there. And then we have possible action. What can be done about this? And who would be involved in that? So we need to educate people, and that includes the scientific community, that includes educators. We need to have changes in legislation and policy, but questions of how to address that and where to address that and in which parts of the chain are kind of important. And we're not really there yet, but we've really started discussions. And there are some things that have started happening. So I mentioned earlier that Kenya has a ban on plastic bags, which was probably the hardest law that's come through, is 4 years imprisonment for using or importing plastic bags. Other countries have banned plastic bags completely. Some countries have started moving away from expanded polystyrene, like this white frigolit, it's called in Swedish, has been banned in some countries. Some countries have also started banning single-use plastic products like utensils, knives, and forks. There's research going into using different kinds of materials in artificial turf to replace the rubber that's used currently. And there's a lot of research going on in terms of textile production. So the clothing industry and the people that are producing the textiles, yarns, are looking at different ways to produce to fibers and yarns and to knit fabrics that will not shed as much fibers upon washing. And there's also work going on in terms of washing machines and filters and sewage treatment plants to remove plastics from the water, so it's not released into the environment. And then this question is what we were discussing down in Nairobi, whether or not international governance gets this problem. So the video that I showed you a few minutes ago shows you how boundary this problem is, that it's really an international problem. And plastics can be produced in one country, sold in another, shipped to a third for incineration, where it's leaked into the ocean and spread to a fourth. So it's really a really complex international question. And there are a number of laws in place that try to address different parts of this problem. And for example, we have the United Nations Convention, the Law of the Sea, the Marpol Convention, which prohibits dumping of trash and waste in the open ocean, the London Convention on the Prevention of Marine Pollution, and then we have the Basel Convention, which addresses transboundary movement of hazardous wastes, and there are pushes to classify plastic as a hazardous waste. The Samoa Pathway, which is addressing the effects and possible measures to manage waste and marine plastic on small island developing states. And then we have the United Nations Regional Seas programs, which are aiming at protecting the marine environment through international cooperation within regions. And a large number of these have political agendas for the management of marine litter. So I think 18 of them specifically address marine litter. And these plans include things like legislation, so they're advisory, they're non-binding, but how you can find clear legislative actions that will help to decrease this problem. So here you can see we have like the plastic bags, deposit fees, taxes or bans, bottle deposit and return systems, which are pretty successful in Sweden. Scotland also implemented this quite recently and has seen a really big decrease in bottles leaking from the system. Best practices, so sort of advising one another on how to handle waste management, infrastructure, composting, recycling. This becomes a really big problem, recycling. We're talking about plastic products because of all the chemical additives that are in there. So it's really hard to recycle plastics when you have mixtures of lots of different polymers, which are completely different materials that contain chemicals. And it becomes problematic if you're taking a plastic that contains high levels of flame retardants and use that to produce children's toys, for example. So that's something that needs to be discussed a lot more. And awareness, and this here has become really, really big in the plastics field. And anyone that has been following that maybe has seen some of these movements, like Beat Pollution and the Plastic Coalition, the Lonely Whale. There's a large number of active groups that are educating the general public and inducing voluntary action, consumer activism, and cleanup programs. And the international community has also acknowledged the importance of these groups and the work they're doing in terms of solving this problem. So I was, as I said, at the UN, and this meeting, so the UN had a meeting this spring called the Oceans Conference, where these questions were really lifted to a global level. Sweden was hosting that meeting together with Fiji, and microplastics and plastics was by far the biggest subject that was discussed at that meeting, along with fishing gear and nutrients, over-eutrophication, ocean acidification, and global warming were others. But this was definitely the biggest. But at this meeting that we had just now, there were a number of resolutions that were submitted to the meeting that were negotiated by hundreds of countries around the world and agreed upon and accepted into action as a plan forward for addressing problems. So there was one resolution on marine litter and microplastics that was accepted on Tuesday after 10 days of negotiating. So I was not involved in these negotiations, but I know they were working from 8 in the morning till 2 in the morning every day for 10 days. And it was going really well from everyone I heard that was inside that room until Russia showed up. And then it kind of really crashed to a halt. But they did agree on some actions. And there were also some others, including a resolution on environmental health and a resolution addressing water pollution. There was a lot of discussions about chemicals at this meeting, and it was the first time that the international community and industry agreed that chemicals in plastics was a problem that needed to be addressed. So in past discussions, plastics have been discussed as a waste problem, that it's a problem of post-consumer plastic. That's a solid waste that needs to be handled in that end of the problem. But now they're starting to see that plastic is a problem from its production, from its raw material production, to the plastic production, to the product production, and there's leakage at every step of the way in this entire chain. There's pushes towards a more circular economy, but that will be hindered by the chemicals in the plastics and the chemicals that are being used in all the plastic materials that we have in our society. So that discussion has finally been lifted to the global level, and industry has admitted that this is a problem that needs to be addressed, which was really interesting and kind of exciting because I've been talking about this for years, and as have others. So this was a really big step forward. These are voluntary resolutions, so they are non-binding and they are not legal tools, but there were also a lot of discussions about movements in that direction. So this is the first step in moving towards international transboundary legal decisions on how to handle this problem that is a really global problem. And I can stop there with a picture of one activist who I've been working a little bit with. This is a Swedish athlete who's the world champion free diver, so she can dive to 126 meters. And she's using her role as an adventurer and extreme athlete to communicate about plastics. And down at the meeting in Nairobi this week, there were a lot of activist groups, and they've also been acknowledged as really important in gathering data and educating the public and advising policymakers about different means to handle the plastic pollution problem. So everyone's sort of been invited to the table here. Industry, policymakers, the general public. And it's kind of nice to see, and hopefully we'll be able to solve some of these problems. But I'll stop there and take questions if you have any.